Work is bullshit.
The work is mysterious and important. And we deal with the uncertainty it brings us in the way that Keir would have wanted. Together, as a family.
There's always been something about a good old theory that just gets me going. Whether it's a historical conspiracy or a theory on some literary or cinematic work, I just find it really entertaining seeing all these little hints and pieces come together to form a different meaning. Well, at least when it kind of makes sense and isn't just the result of severe psychosis.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that?
But anyway, I haven't had a show give me that itch to overanalyze every single word, frame, and barely noticeable lip quiver as much on first watch as Severance has. In classic Apple TV fashion, I knew absolutely nothing about this show before watching, other than the fact that it was in an office and had Ben from Parks and Rec. No, but actually, Apple, can you figure it out? Because there's no reason I should be seeing more marketing for Rescue High Surf than your shows. Anyway, the first season of Severance came out in 2022, and thanks to a friend's recommendation, I finally got around to seeing it 2 years later, and my god, it's a masterpiece. The addiction I felt while binging that first season probably had my brain chemistry looking like a seasoned crackhead. From the cinematography to the attention to detail of the writing, its ability to effectively build suspense and tension, all while having a great cast giving awesome performances, this show has it all. I mean, they got Christopher Walken and John Turturro as basically the show's main romantic force, playing a couple awkward little office weirdos who get bricked up by paintings. And it works perfectly. Okay, now that I've finished meat riding the show to completion, it's time to get to the actual point of the video. What in the fuck is happening? There's still so much up in the air after the first season, and with the second season finally being scheduled to come out on January 17, 2025, I think it'll be good to go through and take a look at everything the show's set up and try to make sense of what is actually happening at Lumon. Now, I'm gonna assume that everyone watching has seen the first season, so if you haven't, go grind it out or read a Spark Notes on it, because there will be spoilers going forward. Also, just as a preface, there's going to be a fair amount of reaching and over-analysis here, and it's very likely that you won't agree with a good amount of what I'm saying, and that's fine. I'm used to people saying I'm wrong and delusional. But at the same time, Severance is an expertly written and well-thought-out show, and I do believe that a lot of these details are deliberate and are seeds being planted for the future of the show. And the show is very self-aware of this too, and does the occasional TV equivalent of emoting to remind us how dumb our theories actually sound.
I mean, what if the goats are the numbers? Like, we're deciding which goats live and which ones... Oh, God.
I doubt it's that.
Okay, and now with all that being said, let's actually get into it. The show wastes no time establishing the shadiness and sinister undertones of Lumon and what's going on in the severed apartments. I mean, about 5 seconds of Miss Cobell can tell you there's something seriously wrong going on.
Keir, chosen one, Keir.
But the thing that gave me the most pause in the early episodes was the introduction of the Perpetuity wing.
It just seems premature. I mean, that place is a lot.
Correct. That place is everything.
Off-rip, we get a sense of unease in the Perpetuity wing as the camera zooms in on a wax statue of James Egan that looks like a sleep paralysis demon ready to pounce, and then it starts playing a voice recording of Lumon's founder, Keir Egan. As we see Petey suffering and dying in the background, Keir explains how his life's greatest achievement is learning that the human soul is composed of what he calls the 4 tempers: woe, frolic, dread, and malice, and that each person's character is defined by the precise ratio of these tempers. And like any great visionary CEO, Keir essentially stole this idea, with the original being the ancient Greek theory of humorism and the 4 temperaments. Now, we'll circle back to the tempers a bit later, but for now we can see that this is clearly a foundational concept to Keir and Lumon. But then, after saying how he tamed his tempers by, quote, walking into the cave of his own mind, Keir says this:
Should you tame the tempers as I did mine, then the world shall become but your appendage.
Kier and Lumon are no strangers to flowery and self-aggrandizing talk about how important their work and ideas are, but this is a particularly interesting and deliberate phrasing in my opinion. By saying this, it's as if he's suggesting that the world is just a small part of you and that it may not even necessarily be needed for your survival. Sure, losing an appendage definitely isn't a trivial thing, but it also often doesn't mean the end. And this description that he gives, sounding as though he's describing how he's found enlightenment, coincides with what we learn later to be the motto or philosophy of Lumon.
If the Egan philosophy is illumination above all.
Illumination beyond all, but yes.
It's also worth noting the deliberate inclusion of Irv correcting Mark that it's not above all, it's beyond all. And yes, we see that Irv has a fetish for getting every detail about Lumon right.
I do think the old photos are supposed to stay on the desk until the new ones come in.
But still, the intentional emphasis of the word beyond here puts more light on this connection between this enlightenment and something beyond. Not to mention that the beyond is also often used to describe the afterlife. Anyway, other than seeing Petey's walk of shame while Kier's recording is playing, we also get a look at the different wax statues of the past Egan CEOs in the Perpetuity wing. And we also get to see frames of the statues' plaques, which show the CEO's lifespans and dates of service as CEO. There's another detail that I found to be intriguing. When you look at the lifespans of the Egan CEOs, they're getting progressively shorter. We see that Kier, who was born in 1841, a time where the average life expectancy for a male in America was less than 45 years old, lived until he was 98. And sure, there's always exceptions, but it doesn't just seem like a coincidence here that the following CEOs, people who are directly related to Kier and are CEOs of a pharmaceutical company with likely the best access to the best medical knowledge, are living less and less. And when you pair this with the Egan bingo card that Dylan gives to Helly having an unexplained Egan death box, which suggests that this was seemingly a theme with the dead CEOs, it does feel like there's more at play. Well, what if the Egans are not dying these sudden, unexplained deaths at earlier and earlier ages, but rather are transitioning in a way? And before my comments get flooded, no, not that transitioning, but I mean somehow they're finding a way to keep them alive or even bring them back to life in some way. And in fact, throughout the show, there's constant references that hint towards this theme of immortality, resurrection, being beyond, or able to surmount death. On top of the Lumon motto, illumination beyond all, that was discussed earlier, there's multiple other instances of such references. In the second episode, as MDR and Milchick do the classic your name, major, and a fun fact about you in a circle, and Mark's fun fact is the good old trauma dump, saying how he's concerned about Petey and doesn't even know if he's alive, Milchick responds with this.
I think this is a good time to remind ourselves that things like deaths happen outside of here. Not here. A life at Lumon is protected from such things.
And of course, this can be seen as just deflecting concern and conversations away from this topic, but a life at Lumon is protected from death? That's making the claims by those adult game ads saying, you will last 5 seconds playing this game, which is like a fucking picture of Shrek or something, sound reasonable. Actually, that might be a bad example, because have you seen him? Fucking goddamn, that's a specimen. Another example is when Irv and Bert are in O&D, and Bert pulls out a painting of what looks to be a young Egan boy deathly ill, and they begin reading a quote describing the painting.
Let not weakness live in your veins. Cherished workers, drown it inside you.
Rise up from your deathbed and sally forth, more perfect for the struggle.
Then you also have Cobell in front of her weird-ass Kier shrine, praying to him.
Tame in me the tempers for, that I may serve thee evermore.
Again, we see this connection and close tying of taming the tempers and eternity here, as she explicitly says, Tame in me the tempers 4, that I may serve thee evermore. And throughout the show, there's a lot of religious iconography and allusions to religion, past just Cobell's reverence for Kier and her praying sessions to him. The paintings, the words of Kier sounding like and being treated as gospel, as well as the handbook being very similar to the Bible, and even the 9 core principles having a lot of similarities to the 7 heavenly virtues of Catholicism. The idea of eternal life is an important concept in many religions, and with Christianity, the religion that is most often alluded to in the show, God is responsible for granting eternal life after death, which is really similar to how Kier is depicted in Lumon. But in my opinion, the most compelling example of these is in the season finale, when Helly's woken up on the outside and has a one-sided conversation with her father, James Egan.
And one day, you will sit with me at my revolving.
The strangeness of the word revolving here directs a lot of attention towards it. And not to be a Webster's Dictionary defines merchant, but revolve means to turn around or to cross and return over an axis. Maybe like dying and passing over to the other side, but then coming back. The use of the word sit is also interesting here, and isn't even the first time it's used during a discussion of death. In the episode just before this, Milchick questions Cobell about her asking to schedule Mark for another wellness session with Miss Casey to test whether they recognize each other, and Miss Cobell responds by saying,
Mr. Grainer sits with Kier now, and I imagine they're both very satisfied with you.
Okay, yes, sits with Kier could just be a fancy way of saying man got murked, but the context of the sentence with Cobell saying that Milchick has availed himself well, and that Grainer and Kier are both very satisfied with him, notice the present tense here, creates this sense that it's important for Milchick that these dead men's seemingly current opinions on him are positive. Then this is further emphasized by the two staring at each other silently for an uncomfortably long time after Cobell says this. Alright, and so what's the significance of the word sit then? Well, I believe sitting here refers to sitting on the board of directors. This would explain why Cobell was referring to Grainer and Kier in the present tense, and why James says Helly will one day sit with him at his revolving, in a way as though Helly should feel proud that she's earned this privilege. And this idea that the board is constituted by past Egan CEOs and possibly some former high-ranking Lumon employees holds some more weight when you consider what we have seen of the board to this point. The board has this sort of intimidating and ubiquitous presence within Lumon, even though there's only a few scenes where the board's present. And in the scenes, we neither see the board or get any information about them. The only representation we see is a little plug-in speaker in Cobell's office, and essentially all we hear to indicate they're present is a static sound coming from the speaker.
Oh, hello.
The board's presence in these scenes creates an unnerving atmosphere, not just for us, but for the characters as well. And sure, if I knew the board of directors at my job was listening in on a conversation I'm a part of, I'd be absolutely shitting bricks. But there's this strong sense that it's more than just that. The board never speaks. The only person who actually seems to communicate with the board directly is Natalie through her Bluetooth earpiece. And the board's silence and mystery is highlighted to us within the first 20 minutes of the first episode. We hear Cobell say that the board will be joining remotely as we get this close-up shot of Milchick plugging the speaker into Cobell's computer. Keep this in mind for later. And then, as Mark tries to thank the board on his way out, Cobell says this.
The board won't be contributing to this meeting vocally.
All the focus that was put into making the board this silent, strange presence is also what added so much weight to the one and only time we do hear the board speak. As Cobell's being fired and we see her start to lose her shit, we get this.
Is the board even there?
Yes.
Some people have speculated that this is maybe the voice of Kier, but I don't really agree with this since it's just such a short sample and it does kind of sound like a different voice. But at the same time, it does seem inhuman in a way. And obviously it's a human voice, but it sounds more like a recording that's being played. Kind of like Siri if Siri was a creepy fuck and could only say,
Yes.
Think about it. Even though voice deepfakes are getting concerningly better as of late, it's still pretty easy to tell when you're hearing an actual person talk versus a machine. And when you consider this and how adamantly Lumon takes the secrecy of what they're doing, it would explain why they have Natalie as essentially the board's mouthpiece whenever they need to communicate something. It would also explain why after the board said yes, Cobell shits herself and looks at the speaker like she just saw the Benadryl Hat Man.
What's this?
Another thing we see in the show that lends more plausibility to the dead board theory is Petey's map, which was actually drawn by Petey's actor, Yul Vasquez, in the style of his real-life art. First of all, there's a lot going on here, and I'd have a better shot at deciphering the Zodiac ciphers than to make sense of everything here. But I still think this offers some valuable insights into what could be happening. The first bigger detail in the map we'll take a look at is the mind room. To play devil's advocate in advance in terms of what this room could be, this could just be referring to the security room with the controls to the severed employees' minds and the different protocols we see. Okay, and now that we got that lame bullshit out of the way, I think that this is where they're keeping the minds and consciousnesses alive. The most likely way that they'd approach this is having the minds be uploaded to some computer or data store, and that might explain why this sort of black box symbol next to mind looks like a computer chip. Also, the room as a whole strangely resembles an eye, with the pupil being the black box symbol, the lines coming out looking like veins which are accentuated by the red highlights, and then they even have a little cross there on the left that can represent the IOC. Additionally, we see some relations between the mind room and the stickman in the bottom right. The stickman has arrows coming out of both of his eyes, another reference to vision, but also has these two antenna-like zigzag lines on his head, similar to the ones coming out of the mind room. This could be a few different things. The eye arrows could be pointing towards some people live here and could be a nod to that. It could just be to highlight the importance of vision in the functions of the mind room, or it could even just be a depiction of the mind control they're able to do through the different protocols. Either way, we'll see with time whether this is just some foreshadowing for the security room or if it's something more. Another major detail in the map I want to discuss is O&D, and the first thing you may notice about O&D's depiction here is the rather distinct references to circuitry and electrical engineering. Other than the container of O&D looking like a rough rendition of a battery, we have three electrical symbols on the outlining circle. Specifically, the X's here, in simple terms, generally represent some sort of connection. A connection to what, though? Well, the coil of doom coming out of the Perpetuity wing seems to be pointing to O&D, and coils also happen to be an important concept in electrical engineering. But then what are the implications of O&D being a sort of battery and being connected to the Perpetuity wing through this electrical system? Well, it's revealed to us at the end of episode 4 that the real O&D is hidden behind a door and that it's actually a pretty huge operation with countless 3D printers. And sure, Lumon is no stranger to secrecy, and we see the efforts they take to create separation between the departments and hide what they're doing. But if these are all just a bunch of innocuous 3D printers, it seems unlikely even for Lumon that they would hide them not only in the severed floor, but have them be even further hidden behind a secret compartment. And maybe the reason why they keep this department so hidden is because of what they're planning on doing with these printers. When MDR visits O&D, we see they are currently printing watering pots, and one of them mentions that the previous week they were printing hatchets. Well, what if they're slowly increasing the complexity of what they can 3D print in order to eventually be able to print organic matter? Then, when they're comfortable with their ability to print inanimate objects, they can move on to printing a relatively simple living organism, like a plant. And we happen to learn that there's a room filled with simple green plants when Irv and Bert have some steamy forehead-on-forehead action. And maybe when they see success with that, they might try to move on to a more complex living organism, like, say, a goat. That could explain why the lone goat room employee was begging them not to take the goats yet, in a way that seemed pretty convinced that wherever the goats were going was going to be dangerous for them. And I can only imagine that whatever the fuck they need to do to the goats to be able to 3D print them would not be very ideal for them. And that takes me to the Coil of Doom aspect of this all. Now, not to judge a book by its cover or anything, but a thing called the Coil of Doom in a clearly ominous place like Lumon probably isn't going to be doing anything innocent and wholesome. But beyond just the name, the fact that it's coming out of the Perpetuity Wing is a significant clue. Not only does the Perpetuity Wing have these realistic wax statues of the Egan CEOs, but we also see in Egan Bingo that there's a box that says Lock of Old Hair. And considering the wing is filled with Egan-centric memorabilia, it's pretty safe to assume that this hair likely belonged to either one or more of the Egans. So if this Coil of Doom is really meant to be connecting to O&D, we're basically seeing that this wing that contains the DNA and embodiments of the Egans is sending something to a room that's filled with advanced 3D printers. And if you remember, we do see something that strikes some eerie similarities to a Coil of Doom. The last aspect about the map that I wanted to bring up is the wellness room. Namely, in the top left corner, we have this little arrow going into a box connected to wellness. What's more interesting is this little icon to the left that looks like it's looking up towards this arrow and is wearing a distinct colored crown. I'm not gonna lie, for an embarrassingly long time, I just thought this was like a long face with an open rectangle mouth, and then I realized I'm a fucking idiot, and this is almost definitely meant to be a ghost. Anyway, I believe there is actually some meaning in this crown-wearing ghost looking into wellness, and that it can be found by taking a look at the wellness sessions. The wellness sessions, not unlike the rest of Lumon, are defined by a super weird and impersonal atmosphere, and despite these sessions being framed as things that will help the employees feel better, they don't feel like they're for the employees at all. They basically entirely consist of Miss Casey reading generic facts that don't relate to their outies, and they're not even allowed to have any reaction or comment to any of it.
That's 10 points off. You have 90 points remaining.
Points?
Please don't speak.
Sure, one explanation for this is that we see Lumon emphasize that they don't like their employees exerting any of their personality and thoughts as to not interfere with the work. And by giving them the most cookie-cutter facts imaginable, they prevent the employees from gathering a real sense of who they are on the outside. But then they're also being recorded and watched. And Cobell is shown to specifically watch Mark's sessions to see whether he and Miss Casey recognize each other, but we don't see her when it's shown that Irv's session is being watched. We just see that it's being played on Cobell's monitor. And it's entirely plausible that it's just Cobell who's infringing on Irv's patient confidentiality here, but it's also interesting to consider that Cobell's computer is where we see the board be plugged into. And if we circle back to the facts given by Miss Casey, amidst all the ones that seem to have been written by a fortune cookie writer, there's one that feels really out of place.
Your Audi likes the sound of radar.
Again, being weird is admittedly not enough evidence, especially with this show.
Jack Frost certainly needs some new dandruff shampoo.
But who the fuck would randomly think of that as a generic fact to give, and what does she even mean by the sound of radar? Well, radar detectors can make a beeping sound, but radars on their own don't make any sound perceivable to us. Radars use radio waves, and without getting into a whole physics spiel, the radio waves are what determine what we hear, and without tuning the waves to a specific endpoint like a radio station, all you would really hear is static. This could definitely just be a coincidence, but it would also explain the nature of the wellness sessions, as well as the ghost on Petey's map. So then where does MDR come into all of this, and how does Scary Number Go in Bin help Lumon cheat death? Well, I believe that MDR is responsible for processing sensory data, the numbers, in a way which encompasses emotional responses and intuition from the stimuli. Or in other words, handling the human parts of cognition that computers are unable to do. And the reasons why I think this is what they're setting up can be found in Lumon's Macro Data Refinement Handbook. Rewinding it back to early in the second episode, we see Helly reading a page in the MDR handbook. And actually, this handbook is available for us to read beyond just a few frames here that I was pausing and zooming in on with no regard to my sanity, because it was released in its entirety by the creators of the show as a part of a free companion ebook called the Lexington Letter. And we'll take a deeper look at that shortly, but for now let's focus on the MDR handbook that's included at the end of it. Obviously, the majority of the handbook is just saying nothing with a lot of words, with this shitty-ass Slenderman dildo of a mascot called Sevi smiling in your face. But there are some pretty important points in here as well. For one, we have the section, what does it mean to be a refiner, that we see Helly looking through. In this paragraph, we see basically the only criteria for being a refiner is to have intuition and emotional intelligence, two innately human skills that computers can't effectively replicate. And then it defines a Lumon refiner as someone who removes impurities from data and reorganizes the data in its purest form. As we see, the way in which they do this is by sorting these numbers into 5 different categories, with each category having a progress bar for the 4 different kinds of numbers: woe, frolic, dread, and malice. And in case the progress bars aren't enough proof that the 4 types of numbers relate to the tempers, there's an entire page in the handbook dedicated to this. Keir says that each man's character is defined by the precise ratio of the tempers within him, and we see that the way to complete a file is by properly filling the categories to a predetermined exact balance. So what we have here is the implication that MDR's refinement is really taming the tempers in some way. And this could actually be the reason why they're so adamant about having everything be neutral and without preference, and even why they have their employees severed. They don't want the refiners to have any individual perspectives or biases while sorting, because then they'd be inserting their own personalities into the data processing. And the book even mentions something along those lines when talking about the numbers. We know you may be curious about what the numbers mean. However, knowing the true meaning behind the numbers could inhibit your natural intuition. Sure, evidently Lumon loves being sneaky, and considering the work environment and what they're probably up to, the added benefit of secrecy is crucial. But based on all the different protocols that we get a glimpse of, and the fact that they can literally split a person's memories, it's more than likely they could have just made them forget what they experienced when they leave for the day instead. Yet they have it so the employees have no memories of their outside lives and no idea what makes them them, in effect, leaving them with basically just their raw intuition and emotions. And what about the numbers being sensory data like I mentioned a bit earlier? Well, basically, we hear Dylan say this as he theorizes the meaning of the numbers.
My theory? The sea.
And he's right. The numbers are the sea, but not the one with fish that's a horrifying death trap, but the sea as in vision. Okay, I mean, obviously I'm joking. That's not my real evidence for this. But funnily enough, the first reference of the numbers in the handbook actually do mention the sea as well. After opening your file, you will be met with a sea of numbers that seem to stretch endlessly in all directions. And also, we see that the numbers have coordinates, which, according to the handbook, show your relative location in the data field. Well, what if the numbers are just encoded visual and other sensory data that map out a person's surroundings? This would explain the use of coordinates and the relative location in the data field, the seemingly endless data, and why files only last for a finite period of time.
Yeah, but why don't we always finish the files?
It only keeps so long.
Even if only a fraction of someone's visual and sensory information is used for refining, that's still an innumerable amount of data. And maybe the numbers may not always trigger an emotional or tempered response, and so there's not enough quote-unquote impurities to finish the file on time. Also, just think about the mechanics of selecting the numbers. You're not typing in the coordinates or clicking each one individually. You're circling a perimeter around the numbers, like you would circle something on an image. Equally, while the 5 categories could just be an arbitrary amount they landed on, it may also represent the 5 senses. We experience constant stimulation of all 5 senses, and a computer walking around would probably struggle quite a bit trying to make intuitive sense of all the stimuli for just one of the senses, let alone 5. This could be again why a human's intuition and senses would be needed, to help guide and even possibly teach something that can effectively sift through that kind of information. Another implication of this, however, is that this data, or mapping of someone's surroundings, would need to be coming from somewhere. And again, based on the overarching deadboard and Egan resurrection theories, and this idea that refining the macro data handles the human side of mental processing, I think the outline here is for MDR to eventually assist those who Lumon brings back to be able to think like people. We do start entering the murky waters of metaphysics here, and there are a number of ways they can decide to approach this, but the fundamental assumption here is that although they can likely keep the dead mind's knowledge and memory in some data store, the soul and human side has probably been lost. But I don't think that any dead have been brought back yet. There's a prevailing sense throughout the show that while Lumon is clearly building up to something big, they're still in the foundational parts of the process.
The departments are pretty spaced out, but it'll all fill in one day. They're planning an expansion.
So if the dead haven't been brought back yet, then who's feeding MDR with this data? Well, this is where the other parts of the Lexington Letter come in. Firstly, although the Lexington Letter isn't concurrent with the show, it's considered canonical, so these things do apply to the show. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do. Again, it's a free, quick, and interesting read. So go ahead quickly and read it if you haven't and you want to, because I'll be getting into spoilers here. Basically, other than the MDR handbook attached at the end, the ebook follows an email exchange between a reporter of the Topeka Star, Daria Thorne, and her editor, Jim M., where Daria is explaining how she received a troubling letter from a severed Lumon employee called Peg Kincaid. The letter, attached to Daria's first email, begins with Peg explaining the circumstances and the suspiciously conveniently timed recruitment ad on the radio, which led her to take a severed job at Lumon. We learn that one day as she was leaving work, she found a note in her pocket written by her innie in a secret pictographic language invented by Peg and her sister when they were young, which explains why it bypassed the code detectors at the time. Her innie confirmed that she was working in MDR, and then they started exchanging letters consistently. After a few weeks, her innie started getting concerned that their head of security, Mr. Dooley, was watching her more closely than usual, leading us to why Peg sent the letter to Daria in the first place, the Lexington file. Peg explains how on Friday, November 3rd, her innie seemed extra excited in her note because she had finished a file called Lexington, a particularly exhausting and complicated file. She completed the file at 2:30 p.m. And when Peg's outie got home and started watching TV, she saw Daria on the news reporting that a truck had been blown up in New York earlier in the day. The truck was owned by Dorner Therapeutics, a major competitor of Lumon, and was blown up at 2:32 p.m., 2 minutes after Peg's innie finished the file. 6 people were killed with no explanation being given, and Dorner reported that some prototype devices of theirs were destroyed in the explosion. Then we get Peg talking about the aftermath. She told her innie and pressed her to get more info, but one of their notes was found by Mr. Dooley. We see 2 final responses from her innie in this time. One saying how she thinks she's right about the connection between the Lexington file and the explosion, and the other being the last note telling her to leave to somewhere safe, and this: nothing they say is real. Distribute the training booklet. Answers are there if you look. This is where the letter ends and where the email chain begins wrapping up as well. Daria's editor Jim responds by immediately dismissing the letter as being a smear campaign by a disgruntled worker and says how they don't have the resources for her to follow up on it since she has to focus on some real shit like the high school basketball playoffs. And then when Daria questioned this, Jim responds again and says it's too late anyway, attaching Peg's obituary, which was clearly written by someone on Lumon's payroll. The sick f***s even asked for a donation to the Topeka Humane Society, an organization almost definitely owned by them, instead of flowers as a memorial. Jim then says that this is really for the best, and insinuates that if she continues with the story, she's going to get sued to oblivion by Lumon. And as if this wasn't enough proof that this Jim M is on Lumon's payroll too, we finally see his full name as he signs off on the last email: Jim Milchick. So then what can we make of everything we see in the Lexington Letter, and what can this tell us about where the show's taking these different ideas? Well, for one, it further spotlights the power and influence that Lumon and the Egan's have. Other than Lumon itself, and the fact that they named a whole-ass town Kier, there are several organizations connected to them, important people across various industries on their payroll, and then political influence and control in media outlets. And we also saw at the end of the first season how Lumon's lobbying to get widespread legalization for Severance. Letting a company operate on your brain and insert a chip is already a very sketch idea, but it gets even worse when the chip literally can control how your mind works. And we likely haven't even scratched the surface in terms of what Lumon can actually do to severed people. When we see Dylan activating the overtime contingency in the security room, we see a number of other protocols. Through pure speculation with the assumption that the names relate to what the protocol does, like with the overtime contingency, I've gone through and made some predictions for what these protocols could do, so go ahead and pause here if you want to take a look. And what does the connection between the Lexington file being completed and the truck exploding mean for the bigger picture? Well, I think it supports the theory of the numbers being a mapping of sensory data in someone's surroundings. The person responsible for the explosion was likely someone with a chip who was controlled or influenced by Peg's refinement to commit the act. The exact mechanics of this are difficult to predict, since Peg's letter implied that the file took multiple weeks to complete, which raises the question of how exactly could you influence someone's mind over multiple weeks to get them to do something the moment the file is complete. Again, there's a lot unanswered, but maybe this means that the file's expirations are actually because they have deadlines for a real-world action they want to complete. Equally, I think it would make sense for Lumon to be using these sleeper agents as sorts of test runs for the capabilities of MDR. These test runs are clearly beneficial for Lumon and help them maintain control through corporate espionage, but also is a way to ensure that when the board's resurrected, they won't just be flush with computers in the brain. Well, I mean, they would still be that, but with someone remotely assisting in the thoughts and mental processes that distinguish people from machines. There's still so much I wanted to fit in this video, like the testing floor and the pretty popular audience theory that the chips contain parts of the dead Egan's minds in some way, but this already ended up being way longer than I planned, and I didn't want to scare away the 5 views I'll get with a movie-length video. But hey, fuck it. I hope at least some of it was interesting and that someone somehow made it to the end here. And if you guys have any other theories, anything you disagree or agree with, or maybe even recommendations for schizophrenia specialists, leave them in the comments and I'll take a look. This is also the first video I've ever made, in case you were wondering why it's so ass, but it'd be appreciated if you dropped a thumbs up and subscribed. Come on. I know you need to get some charity work in. I've seen how fast you say no when you get asked to donate 50 cents to a local children's food bank. Come on. Do it. Okay, I'm done. Thanks.
What separates man from machine is that machines cannot think for themselves. Also, they are made of metal, whereas man is made of skin.